Welcome to The Pie from the Becker Friedman Institute for Economics at the University of Chicago. I'm Tess Vigland. Today's slice of the pie looks at the knock-on effects of the U.S. Supreme Court's Dobbs v. Jackson ruling in 2022. This was the ruling that reversed Roe v. Wade and removed federal protections for abortion. The decision left abortion rights up to individual states. Some strengthened that right, others removed it. And that created what scientists like to call a natural experiment, one that today's guest used to examine contraceptive choices in the wake of the Dobbs decision. So I'm delighted to welcome back to the program Yana Gallen. Thanks so much for being here again.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to talk about research with you.
Excellent. And just briefly, your role here at the university is?
I'm an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy.
Okay. So I hope I described that correctly. The natural experiment, right? You had a point in time at which states across the country diverged on the right to and the availability of abortion. So you kind of had a natural way to look at some of the consequences of that from both aspects, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the natural experiment that we're thinking about is actually that at the time of the leak, not even the ruling,
Hmm.
some states were more hostile to abortion, like they had legislation on the books that abortion would be banned or similar legislation. And so there's an index that was put together kind of at the time of the leak of which states will probably ban abortion. And that's what we look at people responding to, not necessarily whether the ban actually took place. We do that also in the paper, but our main focus is this thing that was very highly publicized, people's kind of perception of the environment that they'll be facing, which is probably, since contraception is something that affects your probability of becoming pregnant, into the future. It takes time to schedule appointments with doctors. We kind of think it makes more sense for people not to necessarily respond, oh, they banned abortion today, therefore I'm going to go and, change my contraceptive choice. You're kind of thinking about a plan in anticipation of future policy action.
So you decided to look at how this affected the behavior of residents that the paper characterizes, as you mentioned, as hostile to abortion, how this would alter their decisions around contraception, what they do without abortion as an option. What specific methods were you looking at?
Yeah, so we, in terms of contraceptive methods, we
Yes.
studied whether we see people more likely to use like very effective forms of preventing pregnancy. And that's mainly two things. Getting things like IUDs or birth control implants, which are called long-acting reversible birth control, and getting sterilization procedures. So like tubal ligation, or for males, vasectomies, which are, called permanent, contraceptive procedures. And we also looked a little bit at the propensity to take out prescriptions for short-acting reversible birth control, like the pill, but we didn't find much there.
So walk us through the data sets that you were using here. I think you might instinctively worry about privacy issues, of course. So how did you get around that, and what were you looking at, and what was the time frame here?
Yeah, so the data does sound like it's private health claims data, but I think the thing that makes it something that researchers can access is that there's really, it's not linked to anything else much about you. So there's a database called Meritive Market Scan, and they serve a lot of, they put together all prescriptions that people get, all procedures that people get, in a hospital care setting or in a doctor's office. And they, sell a database of that for millions and millions of Americans, actually, with private health insurance. You can actually get similar databases for people who are on Medicaid through, at the state level. So we kind of focus on this because it's large commercial claims and just covers a large chunk of the privately insured population. And it allows you to follow an individual over time, which is what's special about the data set. So we can look at, people who were using the pill, are they the ones most likely, do they seem to switch into different forms of birth control? And that I think is a nice aspect of this data set. Um, we can also make sure that we have the same people that we're following over time, rather than, one thing that might happen is people might switch to commercial insurance, or
Mhm.
private insurance, because of the policy that we're looking at. So a nice thing about this is you just worry about that in the back of your mind if you're looking at like moment to moment, claims. So we kind of study the same group of people over time.
And the
And are
time
able to
frame?
do that. And the time frame that we're looking at is just 2021 through 2023. And the reason for that is that we're following the same people over time, so we require them to have the same health insurance over time, and that becomes pretty restrictive if you start to look over a longer period. And then we also we want to go further even than 2023, but so far that's all that's available. So we're thinking of that as kind of the long run. It's well after December 2023, is well after June 2022, when Dobbs was decided, or May when it was leaked.
Right. And then, are you looking at comparisons before and after Dobbs then, and also residents of states that do protect abortion rights? Those come into the picture as well. This is your
Yes, so
control
this is
group,
a
right?
comparison. You can think of it as a comparison over time of people who are in states hostile to abortion versus not. And we're just plotting, the difference over time. And we see that, relative to right before the leak, there's not much going on in the trends beforehand across these states. And then right after the leak, you see an increase in the states that are hostile to abortion. And we follow the trends, this difference over time, and we see that it also goes away in 2023 for the most part.
All right, so let's talk about what you found. And perhaps not surprisingly, there was a spike in people taking some action in the media aftermath of the Supreme Court decision, which, again, as you mentioned, was in June of 2022. What did they do, both men and women?
Yeah, so what we see is that for women, we see an increase in the propensity to get long acting reversible birth control, like an IUD. We also see an increase in the propensity to get a sterilization procedure, and the same for men. So men and women both are increasing their rates of sterilization, or we see an increase in the rate of sterilization um, in the wake of the decision. And that, for almost all groups, in terms of age groups, kind of fades out over time. So we see a large spike immediately after the ruling, basically, and then not much in the year 2023.
Well, in fact, you even say that, you have this spike in July, August 2022, and by September, just a couple of months later, those activities kind of start to get back to their pre-Dobbs differences, right? Can you walk
Exactly.
us through that? Do we know why everybody just who did want to take action, did it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, the data patterns tell us a little bit about the story, but yeah, I'll tell you what they tell us. So, we might expect that part of it is people who are going to, get sterilized in the near future anyway, are just like, well, I'll just do it now because why risk it?
Right.
And so then you'd kind of expect to see, oh, there's an increase followed by actually a negative effect in the hostile states later on, over time. And it balances out to kind of zero. And so you just have this like, oh, there's a bump and then there's a dip, and overall it was nothing really changed. And that's not what we see for almost all age groups. So what we really see is that there's a spike and then there's kind of a zero. And part of that might be people switching, but it must be also true that some people who wouldn't have gotten these procedures, as far as we can tell, do, who wouldn't have gotten them at all. So there's overall a cumulative increase in getting IUDs, or getting sterilized, and among both men and women. But it doesn't seem, if we had just omitted that period, then we see that there's no difference relative to 2021 and 2023. And we can even reject you know, reasonably sized differences. So I guess the question that I think you have to ask is, how much of that is are people still shifting out? Like, is it too short of a time period? If
Mm.
we could observe, till 2025, then maybe this like substitution would be over and we'd still see a very tiny, increase in the rates. And I think that that's possible, but it has to be very tiny, basically, given how much time has passed.
But there was one age group where this
Yes.
didn't hold true, right? And
Yes,
that
and so
was
this
with
paper,
younger residents.
exactly. Research is fun because you get to tell a story where everything I've said up till now is true in the aggregate. But for younger, both men and women, when we're looking at sterilization procedures, we see a very permanent and huge, I would say, in terms of percentage effects, huge increase in the rate of sterilization that lasts through 2023 and doesn't even seem to be fading very much for women. So it's about the same size, increase in 2023 as in 2022. So there's a group of young women that are getting sterilized at higher rates. Now, why does that not show up in the aggregate? Well, because there's a very small, negative effect for other age groups, probably in
Hmm.
part due to the substitution, but also because they're a very small part of total sterilization. So they're like 10 times less likely to be getting a procedure in the first place. So they're a small share of the total, pie. It's just that, but there is some action on this. So, why are young women getting sterilized in the first place? We're talking about 18 to 25-year-olds when I say young. And what does that mean? That they seem to be responding to abortion policy in their kind of birth control decisions. We don't see anything on use of IUDs, interestingly, but for them and for young men, there is an increase in the rate of sterilization that's permanent, it seems like.
And were the women who decided on sterilization using other methods of contraception prior to Dobbs?
Um, they mostly were. So we see that people who were on the pill beforehand seem to be the ones who respond. So it's not people who are like sexually inactive, and we might expect that this has some, impact on things like birth rates. If you get this permanent procedure, and that changes not only the chance that you have an abortion or an unplanned pregnancy, but also the chance that you'll successfully have a planned child in the future. I mean, not for sure. You can get IVF, and the procedures are sometimes reversible, but I think that no doctor would tell you to do this unless you were pretty sure that you definitely didn't want to have children. Yeah.
Right. And did those women already have children?
No. So from what we see, the increase is all coming from people. Like, we can't actually see whether you have a child, but we can see whether
Okay.
there's a person under 18 on your plan. And we see that, the increase is coming from people who don't have a person under 18 on their plan. Um,
So, what does all this tell us about whether the Dobbs decision prompted women and men to take actions that they would have otherwise? Maybe just the timing changed,
mhm.
or they wouldn't have done so at all? Is it possible to tell?
Yeah, I think for young people, it seems like they wouldn't have done this at all, because there's kind of no negative. I mean, it depends on when you think the timing of this is realized. Maybe it's people would have done it 10 years later, and then, yeah, we just don't have the data yet to know.
Yeah.
But to me, the issue was really salient in the time of the leak. Lots of newspaper articles, big headline, lots of legislators were debating this stuff, and so you kind of would have expected that it's on people's minds, in general, much more in the immediate aftermath. But it seems like for these groups of women who, like I said, seem to be sexually active, like they were on birth control before, and don't have any children, so maybe they, are potentially going to have children in the future. They are changing the way they think about their birth control decisions, and it's few of them who respond. It's not that many people overall,
Hmm.
but it seems to be that for the subgroup, the abortion environment is very important in their decision of what kind of birth control to take.
How does all this square with the fact, and you cite this in your study, that abortions actually increased from
Yeah.
2020 to 2023?
Yeah. So I think it's kind of hard to study things like fertility rates, because this was such a huge change to policy, nationwide. It does make it challenging. Like, I think even in our setting, you might be worried that, like, people in non-hostile states are also getting sterilized. Like, we don't really see that in the trends. So really everything is driven, like, things look pretty flat in the non-hostile states. But like I said, in general, you might be worried this was actually a national shock, and it wasn't national policy after all. And so how can we really compare across states? So I think that that's important when you think about what other things were changing, and people were responding politically, like funding, Planned Parenthood and other charities who subsidize abortions to the point that
Or travel to
abortion
get to
or travel
abortions,
to
like
get
pretty
to
much
abortions.
anything around that.
So
Yeah.
in my conversations with one of these charities, they said, yeah, like there's actually a lot of funds that came in, and we kind of prioritize people and like what kind of discount they get. But abortion got very cheap for at least a short amount of time, and I don't think that there's good data on this, so I can't tell you what the numbers were, but I think and how, whether it's still true, but it certainly was true that at the same time that there's these bans in these states, if you did want to get an abortion, there are lots of charities out there trying to help that happen, both financially and like with logistic support. There's also an increase in access to telemedicine in general, and the pill, and or the yeah, not the pill, but Plan B.
Right.
And that's all changing at the same time of these decisions. So thinking about how this is going to affect fertility, like I think there we want to look a little bit longer term because of all these complications.
What does all this tell us about long-term fertility impacts? If there's this higher number of sterilizations, I would imagine that that's going to show up somewhere in the birth rate.
Yeah, so it's just a very small number of people who are responding. That's the thing to remember, that
Mm.
even though we see a large percentage effect, the
Overall, it's not like a bunch of people went out and
yeah,
got sterilized.
exactly. It's not a
Okay.
bunch of people went out and got sterilized. It's like a few thousand young women extra per year, which is meaningful, but it's not going to put much of a dent in the birth rate overall. Even if
Okay.
we're not just thinking about like the present period, but like all the children that you might have over your lifetime. It's still just not that many that we see. I think a caveat is, remember that I'm only able to look at people with private health insurance, and you might expect that the response among people with Medicaid is even larger. That's what my guess would be, but who knows?
Yeah.
So I think it's up to other research to look at that group, and I think that that it may be kind of the main source of the decline in a large increase in sterilization procedures among a group who's more likely to have children in general anyway.
So I kind of described this at the top as knock-on effects of the Dobbs decision. Can you talk about any kind of policy implications here? I mean, I suppose it's obvious. You make one decision and people are going to respond to that in one way or another, right?
Yeah. No, I think the interesting part of the question was kind of like, oh, is, the motivation in a way for studying this is, oh, we have this policy change, on its face, it would seem to increase the birth rate, but maybe it doesn't so much because you have this substitution of people towards things like sterilization procedures that affect not only, these unplanned births, but even future planned births. And we could have a decrease in the total fertility rate in the long term as like kind of an unintended, I think, consequence of this kind of policy. I'm not sure that we're going to see that based on the results, though. So like I said, if we want to talk about directions, then yes, especially among young people, there does seem to be this response that they shift towards super effective and even what's called permanent birth control or procedures that's getting sterilized, but not that many of them do it. So thinking about what the aggregate effects are going to be, it's not obvious to me that there's going to be much.
All right. Fascinating research, Yana. Thank you. Are you ready for a lightning round?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
What books are you reading right now, or would you recommend?
Oh, I turn in my tenure packet at the end of this year, so I'm not reading anything. I'm only trying to produce
Only
output
researching
here.
and writing.
But no, I have a few. I have abundance on my desk there, and I have this book that that I'll eventually get to, which I haven't read, Boys and Sex. So I'm excited.
Interesting. Well, you'll have to come back and report on that.
Yeah.
And what if what class, if anything, kind of changed your life when you were a student?
Oh, that's a great question. Oh, I have 2 that I loved. One in high school, my, high school assistant or, what's it called? Advanced placement micro, AP micro teacher had us read an article about recycling, and it was kind of a libertarian, why you shouldn't recycle, article, and I thought it was so thought-provoking, and it made me realize that economics is like the only coherent, clear way to think about these policy issues, and that, slogans that don't have like a logical framework aren't the way to live my life. So it made me want to become an economist for sure. And then I love these surprising or unexpected conclusions. And I think economists do in general. We're a bit of a contrarian bunch. And then I also really liked. I took at UChicago a class on colonization. I think that's what it was called, and it was brilliant because I came in with very strong, like I would say social justice feelings about things, and the class was really about like, well, let's actually read what people are saying and kind of take our emotions out of it and be rational. So I thought it was I was crying with the professor, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get an A, and she was just like, well, I think you should try to take your feelings out of it and think about what's actually written. And that's been like my motto for all of my research going forward, and I think was a huge development for me. So anyway, that was a great UChicago class.
So you were told to take your emotions out of things when you were what, 20?
Yeah, it was when I was 20, exactly, and in a way,
That could be
probably
a
also when
challenge.
I was 17, that was the recycling article.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, and finally, if you had to make a pie with the current contents of your kitchen, what would it be?
Oh, it's meager. We have apples, though. It would have to be an apple pie. That's pretty much all of the options.
Well,
Yep.
it is September,
Yeah.
so that sounds delicious and appropriate. Yana Gallen, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great having you on the program again.
Okay, thank you. Nice talking to you. Bye.